Father in heaven, we thank you for the beauty of the day. Thank you for the blessing of Sabbath. Thank you for our association as brothers and sisters in the Lord. Thank you for our topic which brings us here today. It's something we're all interested in and involved in, and we want to make the best of it. Bless Dr. Dave as he speaks to us. Bless him with his thoughts. Thank you for his presentations. Thank you for his talents and skills and gifts in communicating them to us. So now bless this time. Thank you for meeting with us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, good afternoon, saints, and I use that word in the biblical sense. A saint is a person who is journeying toward the kingdom. That word has other connotations too. Thank you for gathering. I think I'm just going to jump right into my subject because I'm not very good at extemporaneous talking. I usually get myself in trouble when I try that. I'm fine in conversation one-on-one, but so welcome to the afternoon. There are two presentations this afternoon. In this one, I want to look at what is called the inner dynamic of marriage. And what I want to talk about today, this afternoon, is the fact that there is within marriage, within the marriage relationship, an internal dynamic by which it works or by which it fails. So think about marriage as a relationship that you might say has an engine, it has an element inside of it that makes it work. And of course, if you learn how to make that dynamic function properly, your marriage is likely to be durable. If you don't learn how to make it work, it becomes problematic. But I would like our thought process to begin this afternoon with the understanding that marriage involves the bringing together of two different people. The common idea is that it involves bringing together two similar people. But actually, you're bringing together two people who have both sameness and difference. And the sameness is easily enjoyed when you have similarities and samenesses, if that's a word. You can enjoy those in a relationship without any effort. It doesn't require any work to enjoy where similarities exist. But couples also have differences. And if your relationship is going to be enduring, you have to learn how to manage in a persistent way the differences that you encounter. And it's worth reflecting here for a little while on what makes for difference. And we could actually spend an hour or two on each one of these elements here, but one of the things that creates a difference in a relationship is gender. Men and women are not the same. I know in our culture we like to make them interchangeable, or we like to think of them that way, but there is more and more evidence, even from the study of brains, human brains, that men and women are different. And gentlemen, I have to tell you that the evidence is that the woman's brain is more integrated than a man's brain. It means that in a woman's brain, everything is connected to everything, is connected to everything. Whereas in a man's brain, we tend to take one thing at a time. So gentlemen, you should learn to trust or at least pay attention to your wife's intuitions. They may be better informed than what you think. See? So, you know, there's that difference that has to be managed. Family of origin creates difference. People who grow up in the same family don't get married because they are siblings, which means that the person you marry will be from a different family system. And you don't get to pick your family system, do you? You don't get to pick your relatives. Your husband or wife does not get to pick their relatives. And I said this in class this last week. I said in every family system there are some odd duck relatives. Okay? Now it's funny, my students at the university did the same thing you did when I said that. You all laughed. Which means that this is a nervous response of assent or agreement, isn't it? Right? And you know as well as I that there are relatives who come by and everybody kind of smiles and you look the other way, and yet they're part of a family system. So when two people get married, they come from different family systems, and that creates a difference. And there's nothing you can do to get rid of that difference. It's there embedded in the relationship. It has to be managed. We know a lot about personalities these days, and you may have heard different tests that are done. Some of them are, Myers-Briggs, and you get these 4 letters like INTJ or ENF something, and a lot of people do those tests. I'll just tell you that I've resisted doing those because in my department there's a debate as to what my personality numbers are, and I've never satisfied the curiosity. I don't want to be pigeonholed. Some of you have done different ones that talk about choleric, sanguine, melancholic, and what? Phlegmatic, yeah. And all the phlegmatics think they're the best, and the sanguines are happy with themselves, and the melancholics are melancholic. It doesn't really matter how you want to talk about those. The point here is that personality creates difference. And you can't just get up in the morning and say to your spouse, I really don't like that piece of your personality, get rid of it and let's have something different. It's a difference that is embedded in any relationship. Also, personal history. Not only do people come from family systems, but you have your own story to tell, that not everybody's story, even within a given family, is identical, thankfully. Two people growing up in the same family can have very different life experiences, and when they get married, this is now an embedded difference that is present. And I think I would point out that even though we sometimes feel discomforted by difference, if you realize that difference can work in your favor, it becomes an advantage in a relationship. Let's say that one of you likes to look at details and one of you doesn't. I happen to know some people where the husband told me that if he had to manage the family finances, they'd be in a disastrous situation. He has a wife who likes accounting. And so by combining their differences, they're doing pretty well. Some of you are reclusive. You don't like social situations. And so you marry somebody who's very outgoing and sanguine, and you kind of live in their shadow. I won't name any names, see. But I see some of you looking at each other. You see, that difference does not have to be a source of antagonism. It can be a strength that the two of you together are actually better off than if you're all by yourself. So differences are not automatically bad. But what I want to look at this afternoon, and I said we could spend time on all of those, but what I want to look at this afternoon, what I invite you to look at, is this last one that I capitalize has to do with expectations. See, because expectations are a very big thing in marriage, and the truth of the matter is that this is one area which you can do something about. Okay? You can't fix gender issues, family issues, personality, history, but expectations do create difference, but they do it in a different way that can be managed. So what are expectations? I already mentioned, I think last night, that they are a description of a preferred future. See, I'm thinking about what I would like to see in the future, and it creates an expectation that I would like to see fulfilled. Expectations are held deeply inside us, where we seldom allow other people to look. Okay? I would add that expectations are often very dear to us. Actually, they're amongst our dearest possessions. See, that one of the reasons we keep them carefully guarded is we don't want people in there mucking around. We don't want people in there disrespecting or saying, "Ha ha, you think that? What a crazy person you are." See, because even sometimes our sense of identity is linked to our expectations. See? And as I mentioned last night, and you all laughed about this, what happened to my one more thing here? This button doesn't seem to... Well, expectations cover almost every area in our lives. Okay? Almost every area in our lives. So they're important things, and I will add to that a couple of additions. That our expectations oftentimes are held subconsciously. What I mean by that is that we absorb them in the living of life. We learn them from our parents, we pick them up from our schoolmates, we heard some teacher say something, and they simply enter into our minds as things that are obvious. And so we don't talk about them. You notice on the right side of the slide there, I have there that they are givens. And one of the big changes in society has to do with this very thing that's called givens. In traditional societies, there are not very, there are many givens. You are born into a society and there's girls do this and boys do that and fathers do this and mothers do that, and those parameters are decided for you by society. Of course, in our culture, there are almost no givens anymore. And so we face a very interesting challenge, is that everything now becomes a matter of preference and decision, and we get worn out by making decisions in our culture. In many cultures, there are not many big decisions to make. They are givens, and society provides them for you, and you simply adopt them and you move on. In our place, it's not like that, and I'll just share with you an example. I went some months ago to look at trading in my cell phone. And I've actually become very proud of my cell phone. It's now old, okay? And it opens like this, see? And it has a little keyboard, and I was delighted to find out it's called a feature phone. It's not just a flip phone, it's a feature phone. Okay? Now, it doesn't have access to the internet. I cannot read emails on it. It's actually for my use. I can dial and get phone calls, and by the way, I can get text messages, so I'm not at the bottom rung here, I'm at least one step up. But I thought to myself, maybe I'll go and join the crowd and buy a smartphone. Do you know, after spending on half an hour in one of the phone stores, I gave up. You know why? There are 6012 options. You know the number 6012? It's a fantastic number. Right. There's no way to make a decision in my simple life. There's 5 or 15 different kinds of phones, and they all do different things, and the people who are familiar with them are rattling off all this and that, and I'm thinking, whoa, 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 you know, I just need something that I can make a phone call on, folks. See? That so many decisions, reminds me of a little joke about a lady, a woman who got a job. She got a job at an orange orchard, and the boss, instead of giving her one of those picker bags to carry and walk around, he sat her down at a table that had 3 holes in it. And he said, now, when the oranges come in and the pickers put them on the end of the table, your job is to roll them down this table and size the oranges. Big ones in the little ones first, the middle size, and the big ones. And that's what she did. She sat there all day long processing these oranges, and at the end of the day, some of the people who had been carrying the bags looked at her and said, so, how was your day? She says, I'm exhausted. They said, what do you mean you're exhausted? All you do is sit there all day. She said, yeah, but think of all the decisions I had to make. Yeah. Did you catch it? Some of you are catching on, that's good. I mean, she was worn out by all the little decisions she had to make. And it seems like life is that way. But our expectations are not like that. They are buried in our minds and in our social construct so that we assume their existence. And oftentimes, even if we're asked to explain them, we're not able to do that. If I gave you each one a legal pad, and I said, okay, I'm going to give you the next 45 minutes, and I would like you to write out all your expectations, how well do you think you would do if I put the emphasis on all? Truth is, you couldn't do it. You could write the major ones, but you could not write all of them. And so it is that, at a wedding, when 2 people come and stand at the altar, and I often talk to people about this, do you really know what you're doing when you stand in front of the preacher? Well, no, actually, you don't really know what you're doing. You will find out what you're doing. You know in principle what you're doing. And those of us who've been married a long time, we all look back at the day we got married and we think, wow, we didn't know very much when we did that. See? That you learn a lot more about it. Like, you know enough to make a good decision, but you don't know what you will know after you've been married for a long time, see? So at a wedding, whenever I see a bride and a groom standing together, I think to myself, you know what's really happening here? Two different people are bringing their expectation lists, and they are tying them together religiously and legally. That's what they're doing, see? And they don't really know what the list is on the left or the list is on the right, at least not the total list. See? So marriage has some surprises, and most of them are good, by the way. So I have a little corollary for you. That if you're dating, the more you talk and the longer you date, the higher the odds you will know more of your spouse's expectations, which will equal fewer surprises. Does that make sense to you? See? Or to put it another way, what you don't learn before marriage, you learn after marriage. Okay? That's what happens. And understand that the dynamic of learning after you get married is different from the dynamic before you get married. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is that before you get married, you can always say, no, I'm not going to settle for that. After you're married, the deal's already done. It now becomes, how do we figure this out? Okay, it's much more difficult to adjust expectations after the fact than prior to the fact. See? So that's the implication for marriage that I would point to. Now, some of the complications we face in our society, and this is not true in every society, but in our society, this whole process of discovering expectations and talking about them is complicated, first of all, by the fact that we cannot articulate them, and that's true everywhere, but in our culture, we tend to measure relationships by the emotional level. See? I think the younger you are, the more that is true. That if there's emotional intensity, then you think, ooh, this must be a good relationship. Okay. The other complicating factor is this societal dash toward physical intimacy. You know, in our culture, now even if you're on a secular campus, the first date ideally should end up in bed. See? And these two things, the measuring of relationships by the emotional intensity and physical intimacy, tend to overwhelm the normal progression of a friendship, of a relationship. See, they obscure the reality of things, and expectations simply get lost behind the other things. So, the discovery and negotiation of these different expectations is where the challenge and the work of marriage lies. See? If you hear someone like me talking about working on a marriage, in essence, what I'm talking about is the discovery and negotiation of difference. Where are the expectations different? What has to be done to bring them into balance? And you know, when you think about that and you add in the selfish component that is so much a part of life, you really wonder how marriage could work at all. Am I being too cynical? I don't think so. So as I begin to look at this process, I want to remind you of the definite or the paragraph I put up in church if you were here at the end of the service. This gentleman, Dwight Small, did some very good thinking about marriage years ago, and he wrote the following, that in marriage, two self-centered lives confront each other in the most self-revealing terms. Each challenges the freedom and self-love of the other as they have never been challenged before. Marriage, he said, amounts to the expose of the independently minded, self-directed, and self-devoted person. Now, what he's saying here is that there are no two human beings who get to know each other as well as people who've been married for a period of time, especially a long period of time. And if you've been married for a while, you know exactly how to aggravate your husband or your wife. Correct? Most of you could go home and have some fireworks immediately because you know right where to go to make trouble. You also know the failings, you know the strengths, you know the joys, you know what makes people happy. See? And this knowing, as I mentioned in church this morning, that knowing is a very strange thing because oftentimes knowledge produces contempt. See? We get to know someone and we say, yeah, I know that person, meaning have nothing to do with them. See? Now, in marriage, you come to know someone, and under the grace of God, you still love that person. See? But don't mistake the fact that living together in the same spaces as husband and wife is an enormously self-revealing exercise. You will not be able to hide much from your spouse over time. And they will find out who you are and what you are really like. They will find out if you are the same in the daylight as you are in the dark. They will find out if you are the same in your profession and in your practice. It's unavoidable. See? So they will come to know how you are. Now, those who succeed at managing difference amicably are the ones who find joy and a place of belonging in marriage. Sameness happens on its own, but those who learn to manage difference amicably find joy and satisfaction in marriage, and those who fail struggle, and many times in our culture they end up divorcing. So how does this work? Well, the inner dynamic of marriage has to do with the management of difference, and I think it's very important, and at the same time it's very simple. As I describe this, you're going to say to me, rats, I already knew that. See? So I suspect you already know this, even though perhaps you are not able to articulate it at this point. But in every marriage, realize that each expectation that you have eventually meets up with a corresponding reality. You thought this, you imagined this, and remember, before you get married, you are only picturing something as an imagined thing. Now, I'm not saying that the fact that you imagine makes it bogus. I'm just saying that before you get married, you have only an imagined experience. After you get married, that imagined experience begins to meet a reality, that every expectation you have will meet up with a corresponding reality. And so you will face the fact you expected this and you got, what did you get? See? What did you get? Here was your expectation. Now, what was the reality that it met up with? See? And the truth of the matter is that, and I think I already got ahead of myself here a little bit. The truth of the matter is that in marriage, if an expectation is exceeded by the reality, there's joy. I tell you a story. I had a friend some years ago who married a woman. They got married in their 30s. And she had quietly hoped that one day when she got married, she was a career woman. She ran a little business, and she had hoped that one day when she married, she would be able to marry somebody who would at least help with cooking. Okay? Now, that's not a bad hope, but that's what she hoped. Well, she happened to marry a guy whose hobby was cooking. And when I talk about cooking, I'm not talking about opening a tin can. I'm talking about making your own pasta. I'm talking about making your own pasta sauce. I'm talking about cooking from scratch. Now, as if that wasn't good enough, for many years, he got out of work at 4 o'clock. Or not 4 o'clock. He got out of work an hour before she did. And so for many years in their home, she would come home from work, and on the table would be a gourmet cooked meal for two. Okay? I heard that, wow. Yeah. So, what do you think her life was like? Here was an expectation. Her expectation was fairly modest, but reality checks in way up here. You never heard her complain about cooking at her home? Never. And I actually used to go sailing with this gentleman, and I know he was a good cook because I've sat on numerous evenings in the quiet of a harbor in the cockpit of that boat and eaten some of his food, and ooh, it was good. See, Now maybe sailing improved the flavor, I don't know, see. But this is one element here. You understand that if you have an expectation and the corresponding reality exceeds your expectation, that's the realm of joy. Now, if the reality equals the expectation, I don't mean it has to be exactly equal, but if it's approximately, if it's close, then you're content. See? You're content. Ladies, if you had the expectation that when you get married, that when your husband comes in, he wouldn't drop his clothes and shoes all over the place, and you marry somebody who doesn't drop stuff all over, you're going to say what? Hey, this is good. This is good, right? Now, if reality falls short of the expectation, then there's disappointment. So you have an expectation, and reality is, well, it's not quite there. You're going to be somewhat disappointed. See? If, on the other hand, you find out that there's no hope of the fulfillment of a cherished expectation, then there is, and I just put question marks. See? Okay. There can be serious disillusionment. See? And if you discover that in the majority of expectations that you have in this marriage, there's no hope of them being realized, you'll be a very unusual person if you stay by for very long. See? So, I mean, that's obvious, isn't it? That's how it works in our lives, that you go from one thing to another. Now, I want to throw one little piece in here. I think it's very important that we beware of unrealistic expectations, and we tend to have a lot of these. I remember a young couple coming into my office years ago. They were engaged, they were going to be married, and I asked them a question. I said, now, do you think that you will ever exchange cross words with each other after you're married? And they looked at each other with stars in their eyes. Oh, no, they're not going to do that. They're not going to do that. Well, what would you do in a case like that? You know? I had to, in a gentle way, because I didn't want to ruin their afternoon, you know. But I wanted to explain to them, look, folks, fantastic, and I put that in quotation marks, unrealistic expectations have no hope of being met. Even if you're married and a saint, they're not going to, you can't meet those expectations. And so, if your list of expectations comes from the world of fantasy, you're going to have a very rough time in marriage. Because no matter what your spouse does, it's not going to work. You're just going to live with the sorrow and you know, a dose of realism that you won't want to swallow. And it'll be an unfortunate day if you then blame your spouse for this. So I like to remind people that beware of unrealistic expectations. See? Beware of them. High expectations are good, but unrealistic ones will make for a lot of agony in living. So when you look at this whole thing, there are two variables, and you might want to throw one in here, but one variable is the expectation piece, see, the anticipated. The other variable in this system is the reality. So you can picture them. You have expectations and realities. See, those are the two things. So what can you do in the case of difference? Well, you can lower an expectation. That's one thing you can do. You can lower an expectation. Or the other thing you can do is you can work to improve the reality. See? Those are the two things that you have to adjust, and those are the only two things you have to adjust. Now, observe that these two functions are different. Okay? Because if you have to lower an expectation, it is a sorrowful thing to do, especially if it is a cherished expectation. I share with you an example. I had some friends who wanted to have children. And this is a safe one because neither one of them could do anything about it because it was a biological issue, not an interpersonal issue. But they had wanted children, and they discovered they could not have children. That was a very cherished expectation. Now, by the miracles of fertility medicine, or whatever you call it, some years into their marriage, a way was figured out for them to have children, and they have some today. But I remember the great sorrow that overcame them when they were told initially that it's not possible for you to have children. See? And the grieving process. Now, I said that's a little bit safe to talk about because it does not involve volition, but what do you do in a relationship where there is a cherished expectation that could have been met, but your spouse was intransigent and wouldn't move? And so you are left with the only option of lowering your expectation. You're going to grieve. You're going to grieve. See? And sometimes the lowering of an expectation can take a long time. Sometimes our hopes and dreams die very slowly. We keep trying to resurrect them in spite of the reality that we might be looking at. See? The other side of this is that if you're going to raise the level of reality, that's hard work. Somebody's going to have to knuckle down and start working to shift the level of reality. And I use a stereotypical example here that I often use in marital counseling because it's also safe. Let's assume that the gentleman was quietly hoping that when he came home in the evening, his wife would have a nice warm supper on the table. And it turns out that that's not the case, and he now becomes very disgruntled. It's possible for the wife to say, you know, if this is so important for this guy, I'm going to start making suppers. See? Yeah. That's a dangerous amen, by the way. You know, and you understand that if the wife does that, this is a lot of work, okay? But it helps resolve the difference. It is an act of enormous love and self-sacrifice to do that. And if she were to do that, the husband better be there on time, and he better eat every last crumb. Right? Are you with me on that? See? You know? But you understand that this is now a gift, that there's a difference, and in order to manage the difference, instead of the man could have lowered his expectation, but he was grumbling about that, and so his wife said, okay, well, that's fine. I'm going to, as a gesture of love, I'm going to raise the level of reality. Now, of course, a man, we could talk about the same thing the other way, but I don't have a ready example of that right off, and I said earlier that I don't like to speak too extemporaneously because I get myself in trouble on that. So you understand here that the dynamic of expectations and realities, the goal here is to get either an expectation, a reality to exceed an expectation, or at least be in acceptable proximity. And whether you have to give up an expectation or raise the reality is really a moot point. Because lowering an expectation is also an act of love, isn't it? It's saying that I understand the reality that this is not part of what drives you in your life, so I will find a way to bring my expectation down to the level of our reality. And that's how adjustments get made. And I would list a few things here that I think are important in making adjustments. And I already mentioned one of them, and that is love. And I remind you again that love is a decision before it is an emotion. Love has lots of emotions attached, but it is first of all a decision. And it's possible to love even people and things that you don't like. I didn't say it's enjoyable necessarily to do that. But a decision to be loving and to act in a kind and loving way, a decision to act in a kind and loving way is a decision before it is anything. And here a quote from Dwight Small again. He says, "The one spouse regards the other as created in God's image, infinitely precious in his sight, the object of redeeming grace and love." It does help a lot if you see your spouse as a gift from God whom you are commissioned to love. And in saying that, I would just remind you of an interesting definition of a spouse that I read years ago, that a spouse is a person God brings into your life to show you a completely different way of living. Did you hear that? Yeah, that's what happens. See. Another thing that I would list here is this one, commitment. And again, commitment is a decision. It's a decision. It's one that we make and that we then maintain. And I have another quote here, and I just remind you of your wedding day. That in the last analysis, said Henry Bauman, the element without which there can be no valid wedding is found in the couple's mutual agreement, their I do's or I wills. You realize what that means is that the preacher did not marry you. You married each other by your own saying of vows, and all the officiant did was declare it done. So you willingly said I do to somebody, which means you're married. This mutual agreement is termed consensus. This is what marries them with the sanction of the church or the state. So your commitment is reflected in the voluntary vow that you made, that you then are called on to maintain. And I think we all know how to maintain commitments. If I told you after sundown, if you meet me over at the Blue Palm, I'll buy you all an ice cream, you would know how to take me up on that, right? And I know how to fulfill it, so I'm not making that promise, by the way, just to be clear. But if I was going to uphold my end of the commitment, what would I do? I would show up there, and I would come with a nice wad of cash or a credit card, and I would say to them, okay, folks, help yourselves, I'll be picking up the bill. See? We know how to make commitments, and we know how to maintain them, and that's true also of marriage. You get up every day and you decide, I made this commitment, I'm going to keep this commitment. See? Now, I want to say there are some occasions where that commitment should be broken. Okay? And I want to be very clear about that. Abuse is not acceptable in marriage. Okay? And I would say the first time abuse takes place is the time you should act on it, not the umpteenth time. See? That there are some disqualifiers, that I'm not talking here about an unlimited self-destroying commitment. There are some, and you know, people who have had to go through that experience should receive our love and support, not our criticism. Okay? That people who have had marriages that are not sustainable for significant reason need our love and support. We shouldn't be picking at them. Okay? Not that we should pick at anybody, but I want to get that piece in there. The third thing, and I've mentioned this numerous times this weekend already, is the question of self-sacrifice. That's the only thing that makes marriage function, folks. If you're in marriage for yourself, if you're a selfish person and you're using it for your own selfish desires, it's not going to be a good experience for your spouse, and ultimately won't be a good experience for you either. Okay. And I remind you of the gospel advantage that I preached about this morning. So I think that there's need for us to be charitable in this process of balancing expectations and realities, because adjustments in marriage cost somebody something. Whether you're lowering an expectation as an act of love, or whether you're raising the reality as an act of love, it's costly. And so we ought to be kind to each other when the process is working, and recognize that short-term effort often pays very big dividends in the future. Some work done here and now can produce very big dividends in the future. I like what somebody said, you need to plan to forgive your spouse every day. Just start the day out recognizing you'll have to forgive your spouse. You know why? Because your spouse can have to do the same thing for you. See, that's the nature of life. I like this saying, before marriage, have both eyes open, after marriage, close one eye. Does that make sense? See? Yeah. But we need to be charitable, we need to be kind. Another thing I would say here is that, well, I see I have some active slides on the screen, but not on my computer, so I don't know why these two things are talking differently. But you know, when it comes to computers, they are things of marvel, and they are mysterious, and I leave that to the experts. I just use them when I can. So, another point I would like to make here is that in marriage, underneath every agitation, every rub, what do I want to word? What word do I want? Every incident is either selfishness or an unmet expectation, or perhaps both. Okay? If you're contending with your spouse, stop for a minute and ask yourself, what's going on here? Is this an act of selfishness on my part, or am I dealing with an expectation that is not being met? And you know, you cure selfishness with the gospel, but you cure the unmet expectation with negotiation. And I like to tell people that if you find yourselves fighting a lot, instead of fighting, stop long enough to figure out what's underneath it. Is there an expectation that's not being met? And instead of fighting, start negotiating. Okay? If it's selfishness, then that's treated by being on your knees, and it's treated by apology. And I remind you that I'm speaking in ideal terms here. None of us can look at our spouses and say, well, I'm pretty good at this. See? Because all of us in the quiet of our own lives know that we have been a little ornery, right? We've all done that, see? And so an expression of love to your spouse goes a long way to remind them that even though you are a little cantankerous sometimes, it's not really because you don't like them, it's because you're just a human. See? One last thing for this session. And have I talked long enough? Yeah, not long enough. Well, I'm getting done. Whether we wait till, what was the next time, 4 o'clock? 4:30. Or maybe we'll move it up to 4 if you don't mind. Okay. I want to just share another little thing with you called the 80-20 rule. Have any of you ever heard of the 80-20 rule? Oh, good. There are some of you. You must be in the business world, perhaps, or somewhere. Okay. The 80-20 rule is also known as the Pareto principle, and it claims that there is an interesting relationship between 80% and 20%. Okay. And let's see if we can explain that a little bit here. That if you are in the business world, you would probably agree that 80% of business comes from 20% of your customers. It's typical, right? 80% of your business. Now, it's also true that 80% of the aggravation in your life comes from 20% of the people you know. Right? And in fact, I sometimes think that might be 90-10, not 80-20. Right? In public health, they will tell you that 20% of the hazards produce 80% of the injuries. See? And in the computer world, 20% of computer errors produce 80% of the troubles. That's just how this is. I would extend this even to the building trades, or working with your hands, that 20% of a job will use up 80% of the time that you allocated for it. Have any of you ever worked on a transmission? You know, I remember taking one out and I got all the bolts out except one. I couldn't get one of those out up on the top of the bell housing. And I think I spent hours trying to get that thing out. And I remember one day lying under my car with a whole bunch of extensions, finally getting up there. And I lay under my car and I said, you know, something is going to break here. Either I'm going to break, or my wrenches are going to break, or the bolt is going to break. And fortunately, when I laid on that whole system, that the bolt finally came undone. But, you know, that's 20% of the job or less, and it took 80% of the time. Okay. It's simply how it is. Now, the Pareto principle, or the 80-20 rule, has some applications to marriage. One of the first is that 80% of expectations met equals a good marriage. We tend to think of marriage as 100% satisfaction. Actually, the truth is that if 80% of the significant expectations you had in life are met in this marriage, you ought to be very glad, and you ought to spend your time enjoying the 80% and working on the 20%. And unfortunately, what happens in our country, because we are into this magical matching mode, we think to ourselves, well, this should be 100%, and since it's not, I must have made a mistake. And so people bail out of their marriage. Instead of working to adjust the 20%, they bail out. And they discover that they were so unhappy over the 20% they didn't have that they found a spouse who supplies the 20%, but now they don't have the 80%. Okay? That's how it works in our culture. See? And I've often told people who are thinking of divorcing, you know, before you do that, just realize that you've been married for 10 years or 12 years, you're at a point where you actually could renegotiate something substantial. If you bail out and start again, it'll be 10 years before you're back where you are. See? And most of the time, they're upset over the 20%. Work at the 20% and enjoy the 80%. Don't trade the 80% you do have for the 20% you don't have. It's not a very good deal, see? And another application in marriage is that working on 20% of the issues will resolve 80% of the struggles. So if you have two things, let's say, that are out of whack, and you work on those, that 80% of the struggles you have in your relationship will disappear. For example, let's say that you cannot agree on finances. So number one problem in American marriages, by the way, disagreement over money. And if you want to know the number one problem of number one problems, it's debt, especially credit card debt. So let's assume that you're in a marriage where a credit card is creating all kinds of trouble and headaches. So you say, well, how are we going to work on this one little thing called credit card debt? And so you agree to take the credit card and bring a pair of scissors up alongside of it and give one squeeze. So the credit card is gone. Guess what you've just done? In all likelihood, if you maintain that, you have solved 80% of the aggravations on that subject. See? So the 80-20 rule I've found to be a very valuable tool to not only inject some realism into marriage, but it also brings about the realization that if you work on the things that are aggravation, you can solve sometimes a large percentage of your struggles. And this is why I think there are many, many couples who will tell you that their marriages went through a period of time of difficulty, but they kept working and negotiating, and they moved their relationship to a new level. And they are very grateful that they remained doing that. Now, I end this by, and I'm happy to have some discussion after this, I end this by pointing out to you that this tension of balancing expectations and realities is lifelong. I will guarantee you that if you talk to people who've been married, how long? 62 years, right? I will guarantee you, and I'm not going to ask them publicly, but I bet if you ask them privately, they will tell you that there are still issues that are connected to expectation and self-interest that arise. Okay? They may be diminished some, and they may not be as intense as when you first got married. But this is something that requires us to work on it. And I do think, though, that over time, and it's especially true if you learn to manage these, that you smile about issues of the past. I'm going to add one story. I knew a couple once that I used to smile at. I never had the courage to ask them about their marriage, but I used to watch it from the outside. They were older people when I knew them. And the woman was one of these very quiet, meek, smiling, gentle people. Now, I didn't live in her house. Maybe she was tough as nails at home, but in public, she was a very gentle, we like to refer to women as sweet. I'm not sure why we do that, but she was one of these kind, and her husband was a very interesting guy. He was cantankerous. He was a curmudgeon. He was a very good man. In the years that I knew them, if I had broken down on the highway, I would have called him. And he would have come, but he would have grumbled about it, He said, well, Pastor, what's your problem? How come why didn't you tell her? He would have had something to say. And all the way home, he would be told grumbling and mumbling, see? And a very good man, but he was always grumbling. And I used to think to myself, I wonder what it was like when they got married. See? Here was this guy, he worked outdoors, he did stuff like logging and truck driving, and he was a rugged man. And she was this quiet woman. And I've played in my imagination, and this might be completely imaginary, but I used to think to myself, I wonder what it was like when they got married. Because those differences were going to have to create some tension that they learned to negotiate, because when I knew them, I think they'd been married about 58, 60 years. I never asked them, but I'm quite sure, because when I knew them, his health was failing. And I'm convinced that when he died, and I've lost track of them, that was in years past, so I don't know the end of their story, but I'm pretty sure he died first. And I'm also pretty sure that in her sorrowing, one of the things she sorrowed was the grumbly nature of her husband. Because she learned that as long as he was grumbling, everything was fine. Right? Long as he was grumbling, the world was still on its axis, and the sun was coming up and the sun was going down. See? So you understand that we learn to accommodate to each other in good and happy ways if this process of managing difference is alive in our lives. So I share this with you, hoping that it will be of some benefit, that if we brought the 80-20 rule into our lives and we focused on the management of difference, a lot of the struggles that people have in marriage, I think, would decline, maybe not in one day, but certainly over a period of time. So I don't know if some of you want to ask some questions, and I would just remind you of something, that when you ask questions in a public forum, you reveal something about yourself. Now nobody will ask any questions, right? When we go, no. See, now this is the danger of using example. He wanted to know when we're going to the Blue Palm. See, I said I am not going to do that. I was only using as an example. Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, I suggest we take a little break, and why don't we take a 20-minute break? Can we come back at 4:15? Are you okay with that? Give me a little bit of a chance to rest and catch up with myself, and about 15 minutes from now we'll crank it up again. So call your friends and tell them to come quick. All right.